At 52 years old, after 2 decades in the Navy, I believed the sea had no more secrets to show me. I was wrong. As security commander of the Glacier Empress, my world was one of order, not mystery, especially here in the icy silence of the Alaskan Inside Passage. Then, during a routine inspection deep in the ship's belly, we found it tucked inside a service void that hadn't been opened since the vessel was built. It was a perfectly preserved suitcase from another era, waiting in the dark. We followed protocol, but when the authorities finally arrived and saw what we had pulled from that forgotten space, their professional masks slipped. Their faces went completely pale. The sea doesn't give up its dead, but sometimes it hides its secrets where you least expect them. Would you have dared to open it? Let me know in the comments, subscribe for more, and tell me what city or country you're watching from. My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm 52 years old, and for the better part of my life, the sea has been my office, my home, and my constant companion. After 20 years in the Navy, you learn the ocean's rhythms. You learn the groans and sighs of a ship as it cuts through the water, the way the air changes just before a squall, the precise pitch of the engines that tells you everything is running as it should. Here, as security commander of the Glacier Empress, my world is even more contained, more predictable. The Alaskan Inside Passage isn't the Persian Gulf. There are no pirates, no geopolitical tensions. My concerns are fire doors, passenger disputes over deck chairs, and ensuring the 1,000-plus crew members follow protocol. It's a life of meticulous routine, and I like it that way. Order is a comfort. My days start before sunrise, with a cup of strong black coffee in the mess and a review of the night's logs. By the time the first passengers are stirring for their morning excursions to see glaciers calve into the sea, I've already walked half the ship. My world is the one they never see. The labyrinth of service corridors on the lower decks, the hum of the laundry facilities, the clatter of the galleys, the engine room's deafening heart-like thrum. This is the ship's soul, and my job is to keep it safe and sound. The route itself becomes a backdrop, a beautiful but repeating pattern of forested islands and icy fjords. Seattle to Juneau, Juneau to Skagway, and back again. The faces of the passengers change, but the ship, the sea, and the routine remain. That particular day, the third of our voyage, started no differently. The air was crisp and carried the scent of pine and salt. We were gliding through a stretch of water, so calm it looked like polished obsidian. I was in my office on Deck B, reviewing surveillance footage, a mind-numbing but necessary task, when my radio crackled. It was a young officer, Daniel Foster. Good kid. A little too eager sometimes, but sharp. He was on his inspection round on Deck C, aft, near the primary engine access trunk. His voice was calm, professional. "Commander Thorne, this is Officer Foster. I have a minor hull integrity anomaly to report on Bulkhead 7 Charlie. Requesting you take a look when you have a moment." An anomaly? The term could mean anything from a loose bolt to a stress fracture. But in a section of the ship as critical as the engine housing, nothing is truly minor. I told him I was on my way. I left my office and descended into the ship's belly. The deeper you go, the more the vessel feels like a living thing. The plush carpets and soft lighting of the passenger decks give way to bare, painted steel, stenciled warnings, and the constant vibrating energy of the machines that push this city of steel through the water. The air grew warmer, thicker, tasting of ozone and hot metal. I found Foster standing in a narrow corridor, a fluorescent light buzzing overhead. He was looking at a section of the bulkhead, a massive wall of steel that separated the service corridor from the ship's structural voids. "Right here, sir," he said, pointing his flashlight. I followed the beam. At first, I didn't see it. The wall was a seamless expanse of gray paint, crisscrossed with electrical conduits and hydraulic lines. Then he moved the light slightly, and I saw what he meant. A rectangular service panel, about 2 feet by 3, was set into the wall. It was supposed to be perfectly flush, sealed with heavy-duty bolts. But one corner was raised. Just a fraction of an inch, no more than the thickness of a credit card. But it was enough to break the perfect line of the bulkhead. It looked wrong. "You see it?" he asked. "It's barely anything, but it's not on any of my schematics as a regular access point." I ran my gloved hand over it. The panel was cold and solid. It wasn't loose from vibration. It felt like it had been pushed, ever so slightly, from the inside. "Chief Brooks." I called on my radio, summoning my most experienced non-commissioned officer, Samuel Brooks, a man who'd forgotten more about ships than Foster had yet learned. While we waited, I checked the ship's original blueprints on my tablet. Foster was right. The panel was there, on the 40-year-old drawings from the German shipyard, but it was marked as a sealed construction access point. According to the plans, behind that steel plate was nothing but insulation, structural ribbing, and then the outer hull. It was a dead space, a void that hadn't been opened since the ship was first welded together. Chief Brooks arrived, his expression as weathered as a barnacle-covered pylon. He took one look at the panel and grunted, "That ain't right, Commander. Looks like something's behind it." My mind raced through the possibilities. A structural failure? A burst pipe we didn't know existed? My training screamed at me to consider every possibility, from the mundane to the malicious. I grabbed a heavy-duty wrench from a nearby toolkit. The bolts were stiff, coated in layers of paint from decades of maintenance. It took all my strength to get the first one to turn, the metal groaning in protest. One by one, we worked the bolts free. The air in the corridor was tense, the only sounds our breathing and the screech of tortured steel. With the last bolt out, I carefully pried the heavy panel away from the wall. A puff of cold, stale air escaped from the opening, carrying a faint, musty smell, like an old book that had been sealed for a century. It wasn't the smell of seawater or decay. It was just old. I peered into the darkness, but my eyes couldn't adjust. Foster handed me his high-lumen flashlight. I aimed the beam into the void. It cut through the blackness, illuminating a small, cramped space filled with thick, yellowed insulation foam. And something else. Sitting squarely in the middle of the void, propped against a steel beam, was a shape. It was rectangular, with rounded corners and two chrome latches that glinted in the flashlight's beam. It was an olive-green suitcase. It looked like something my grandfather would have carried. A hard-shelled Samsonite from another era, perfectly preserved, without a speck of dust or a hint of rust. It looked as if it had been placed there 5 minutes ago, not 40 years. We just stood there, the three of us, staring in silence. The steady thrum of the ship's engines suddenly felt like a slow, pounding heartbeat. The protocol book has a procedure for an unidentified package, but it has no procedure for a ghost. My training said to back away and report it. My gut, the one I'd learned to trust through years at sea, told me this was something else entirely. What would you have done? Followed the rules, or let curiosity take the helm? Let me know your thoughts below. And if you want to find out what happened next, make sure you subscribe. I always enjoy seeing what city or country you're watching from. My training screamed at me. Every instinct honed over 20 years in the Navy kicked in with the force of a full-scale alarm. The first word that formed in my mind was IED, Improvised Explosive Device. The protocol is immediate, absolute, and unforgiving. Clear the area. Establish a perimeter. Notify the bridge. Alert the authorities. Don't touch anything. It's a litany I could recite in my sleep. I looked at Foster, then at Chief Brooks. Their faces were tense, waiting for my command. The order to evacuate the entire aft section of Deck C was on the tip of my tongue. But I hesitated. My hand, which had started to reach for my radio, stopped mid-air. Something was wrong with the picture. I took another look, forcing my mind to move past the initial panic response and into analysis. The suitcase sat there, perfectly centered in the small void. It was clean. Too clean. An explosive device, especially one hidden for decades, would be subject to the environment. There would be dust, maybe condensation, corrosion on the metal parts. This case looked like it had been packed yesterday and placed there this morning. Furthermore, the space itself was a construction void, sealed since the ship left the shipyard in Hamburg 40 years ago. Who would plant a bomb and then have it welded into the ship's skeleton? For what purpose? A time-delayed threat from half a century ago? It made no sense. The logic of it was a tangled knot my mind couldn't straighten. "Brooks," I said, my voice low and steady. "What do you see?" He squinted, his gaze running over the case. "I see something that ain't supposed to be there, Commander. But it don't feel angry. You know what I mean? It just feels patient." Patient. That was the word. It was waiting. I turned to Foster. "Go to the security locker. Bring me the portable scanner. And the magnetic wand. Move quickly and quietly. Don't say a word to anyone you pass." He nodded, his youthful eagerness replaced by a focused gravity, and disappeared down the corridor. While he was gone, Brooks and I stood a silent vigil. The only sounds were the hum of the ship and the buzzing of the fluorescent light above. The air felt thick, charged with unspoken questions. Foster returned, carrying the equipment. I took the magnetic wand first, a simple tool, but effective. I extended it into the void, sweeping it carefully over and around the suitcase. Nothing, not a flicker. The latches were chrome, but the internal mechanism was likely brass or stainless steel. Whatever was inside, it wasn't a large mass of ferrous metal, like a pipe bomb. Next, I took the scanner. It's a handheld unit, mostly used for screening suspicious luggage in the event of a passenger dispute or a security flag. It's not military grade, but it paints a basic picture. I held it steady, aiming it at the case. A ghostly, greenish image materialized on the small screen. I saw the outline of the case, the hinges, the latches. Inside there were shapes. Dense shapes, but they were simple. A rectangular block. A solid cylinder. No complex wiring. No battery pack. No detonator. My heart rate, which had been pounding a steady rhythm of alarm, began to slow. This wasn't a bomb. My training manual had no page for this. The book said to report the unidentified package and wait. But my gut, the one that had kept me alive in the Strait of Hormuz, was telling me something different. It was telling me that what lay inside that case was more important, and perhaps more dangerous in a different way, than any explosive. To hand this over unopened to the port authorities in Juneau felt wrong. It felt like turning a key without ever knowing what door it opened. It felt like a dereliction of a different kind of duty, the duty to understand the vessel under my command. This suitcase was a part of the ship's history, a secret it had carried in its iron belly for 40 years. I looked at Brooks. He met my gaze and gave a single, slow nod. He'd seen me make calls that weren't in the book before. He trusted me. That was enough. "We're opening it," I said. The words hung in the air, a clear and deliberate breach of protocol. Foster's eyes widened, but he said nothing. Together, Brooks and I reached into the void. The suitcase was heavier than I expected, solid and dense. The plastic shell was cool to the touch. We lifted it out and placed it carefully on the steel deck plate of the corridor. For a moment, we just looked at it. An olive-green relic from a world of landlines and Cold War spies, lying in the heart of a 21st century floating resort. I knelt down, pulling a small pry tool from my belt. The two chrome latches were stiff. I worked the tool under the first one and pushed. It gave way with a loud, metallic, that echoed down the hallway. I did the same to the second. Another click. I paused, took a deep breath, and lifted the lid. There was no explosion, no hiss of gas, just a faint, dry smell, like an old library, a scent of paper and time itself. The inside was lined with simple gray foam, and nestled within were 3 items. The first was a bundle, wrapped in dark, heavy oilskin, tied securely with twine. The second was a cylinder of dark, matte-finished metal, about 8 inches long and 3 inches in diameter. It was surprisingly heavy when I lifted it, and it felt non-magnetic, inert. And then there was the third item, tucked into a pocket in the lid. It was a single photograph, black and white, perfectly preserved. It showed a man, perhaps in his late 40s, with a square jaw and weary, piercing eyes. He was gaunt, unsmiling, and wearing the uniform of a high-ranking officer in the Soviet Navy. The insignia on his collar was unmistakable. My blood ran cold. This wasn't lost property. This wasn't a time capsule from a worker who built the ship. This was intelligence. This was espionage. This was a ghost from a war that was supposed to be over. A secret message left in a bottle of steel. The entire context of our voyage shifted. We weren't just sailing through a scenic passage. We were sailing over history, over secrets that governments had fought and killed to keep. I carefully closed the lid, the soft click of the foam sealing the contents away once more. The moment of discovery was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of what I now knew. I looked at my men. Their faces reflected my own shock. I ordered them to help me place the case back in the void, and we bolted the steel panel shut, tightening the bolts until our knuckles were white. "You did not see this," I told them. "This conversation never happened. We found a loose panel and we secured it. That is all. Understood?" They both nodded, their faces grim. I walked back through the ship's metallic arteries, the steady thrum of the engines, now a slow, ominous drumbeat. This was far above my pay grade, far beyond the scope of a cruise ship's security chief. I entered my office, locked the door, and picked up the secure satellite phone. I dialed the captain's personal extension. He answered on the first ring. "Captain," I said, keeping my voice level, "this is Thorne. I need to see you in your quarters. Immediately. And sir, we have a situation that is not in the manual." We had pulled a secret from the belly of my ship, a secret that had been sleeping for 40 years. The rules said to leave it alone, to call the authorities and let them handle it. My gut told me the truth was worth the risk. Would you have dared to pry open those latches, knowing it could cost you everything? Let me know what you would have done. And if you want to know what the captain said, and see who was waiting for us when we docked in Juneau, make sure you subscribe. I'm always interested to see where in the world you're watching from. The journey to Juneau was the longest 6 hours of my life. Every creak of the ship, every routine announcement over the PA system felt like a countdown. The secret we had resealed in the ship's belly felt like a radioactive core, pulsing with a quiet energy that only the captain, Brooks, Foster, and I could feel. We docked under a gray, overcast sky, the mountains surrounding the port shrouded in mist. As per our discreet report, 2 Coast Guard officers were waiting on the pier. They were young, professional, and completely unprepared for what they were about to encounter. They came aboard and we led them to the captain's conference room, a sterile space of polished mahogany and leather chairs that suddenly felt like a stage. I had retrieved the suitcase myself just before we docked, carrying it through the service corridors with a sense of dread and reverence. It sat now on the conference table, an anachronism in a world of flat-screen displays and satellite internet. The Coast Guard officers began their standard procedure, asking for our statements, but they barely got through the first few questions before the captain's personal phone buzzed. He answered, listened for a moment, and his face became a rigid mask. He hung up and looked at the 2 officers. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth, "your superiors have asked you to stand down. You are to return to your cutter and await further instructions. 2 other individuals are coming aboard to take lead on this matter." The young officers exchanged a confused glance, but didn't argue. An order was an order. They packed their notepads, gave the suitcase one last curious look, and left without another word. The room fell silent. We didn't have to wait long. 5 minutes later, 2 men entered. They were in their late 40s, dressed in nondescript dark suits that did nothing to hide their athletic builds. They moved with an economy of motion that spoke of federal training. They didn't introduce themselves by name or agency. The taller one, with sharp features and cold gray eyes, simply nodded at the captain. We'll take it from here. The other, broader and with a permanent scowl, set a heavy-duty aluminum case on the table. They didn't seem surprised or alarmed. They seemed prepared, as if they had been waiting for a call like this for a very long time. They asked us to leave the room, but the captain held his ground. "This is my ship. My officer made the discovery. We will be present." The tall agent looked at him, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes, but he conceded with a curt nod. "You will remain silent." The second agent opened their case. It was filled with precision tools, digital calipers, and forensic equipment. He put on a pair of thin black gloves and approached the suitcase as if it were an unexploded bomb. He didn't pry it open like I had. He examined the hinges, the latches, the seams, photographing every detail. Then, with a delicate touch, he opened the lid. He carefully lifted out the 3 items and placed them on a sterile white cloth he'd spread on the table. First, the photograph of the Soviet officer. The tall agent picked it up, holding it by the edges. He stared at it for a long, silent moment. His expression was unreadable. He then turned his attention to the heavy metal cylinder. The second agent ran a series of scanners over it, the devices emitting soft, electronic chirps. No power source. No radioactive signature. High-density, non-ferrous alloy. Possibly titanium with a lead core. The tall agent simply said, "Beacon, leave it." Finally, he focused on the oilskin bundle. The twine was old and brittle. He didn't untie it. He snipped it with a pair of surgical scissors. He carefully unfolded the stiff, dark fabric. Inside was a roll of parchment-like paper, yellowed with age but perfectly preserved. He unrolled it across the table. My breath caught in my throat. They were maps. Hand-drawn, meticulously detailed naval charts, covered in Cyrillic script and complex depth markings. The tall agent leaned over them, his eyes scanning the lines and symbols with an intensity that made the air in the room feel thin. He pulled a tablet from his jacket and brought up a modern, high-resolution satellite map of our current location, the Alaskan Inside Passage. He placed the tablet right next to the old Soviet chart. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Then he spoke, his voice a low, disbelieving whisper. "My God." He pointed a gloved finger at a section of the old chart, then traced a corresponding line on the digital map. "According to this," he said, tapping the fragile paper, "there's a deep water channel. It runs from the Lynn Canal directly under the Mendenhall Glacier and comes out in the Taku Inlet." The other agent looked up from his scanners, his scowl replaced by a look of sheer astonishment. "That's impossible. Our geological surveys, the Navy's own charts, that entire area is charted as solid bedrock for miles. A glacier sits on top of it." The first agent looked at him, his gray eyes wide. "The charts say the bedrock is a shell. Underneath it is a subglacial river, carved out during the last ice age, deep enough and wide enough for a Typhoon-class submarine." The mystery of the suitcase was laid bare in that instant. This wasn't just a relic. It was an operational package. The charts were the map to a secret, undetectable submarine passage, right through the heart of Alaska's coastline. And the metal cylinder? The agent picked it up, his voice flat with realization. "It's a short-range encrypted sonar beacon. A guide. You drop it at the entrance, and it pings a specific frequency that only their subs could follow through the darkness under the ice. A contingency kit. Left here, welded into the hull of a civilian ship, by a sleeper agent who worked on the construction crew in a German shipyard 40 years ago. A ghost from the Cold War, reaching out to tell us that the ground beneath our feet, the very maps we trusted with our lives, were a lie. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan air. We were sailing over ghosts and secrets, over an invisible highway for our greatest enemy. The agents packed everything away with a quiet, grim efficiency. The suitcase, the charts, the beacon, the photograph, it all disappeared into their aluminum case. They were erasing the discovery as quickly as it had been made. Who was that man in the photo? How many other secrets like this were still out there, hiding in plain sight? Would you have had the courage to pull that case from its dark hiding place, knowing it could rewrite history? Let me know your thoughts. And if you want to hear what happened after they left, make sure you subscribe. I always like seeing what part of the world you're watching from. The agents left as quietly as they had arrived. The door to the captain's conference room clicked shut behind them, and the silence they left in their wake was heavier than any anchor. The suitcase was gone. The charts, the beacon, the photograph of the man with the weary eyes, all of it had vanished into their sterile aluminum case, as if it had never existed. We were left with nothing but the slight indentation of the case on the mahogany table, and a story that we were now forbidden to tell. The captain, a man I'd always known to be unflappable, sank into his chair and stared at the empty space on the table. He looked 20 years older. He ran a hand over his face and finally met my gaze. "Thorne," he said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried across the room. "What we saw in this room, what we learned, it stays in this room. Forever." That's a direct order from people who don't have to write their orders down. The official report was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction, an insult to our intelligence, but a necessary one. The section of my security log detailing the discovery of the loose panel on Deck C was carefully amended. The entry now stated that we found a, quote, discarded piece of luggage containing an elaborate and historically inaccurate movie prop. A movie prop. As if some forgotten filmmaker from the 70s had decided to weld a fake Cold War spy kit into the guts of a cruise ship. It was absurd. But it was also airtight. It was the kind of story that was too strange not to be true, and too silly for anyone to investigate further. It was the perfect lie. My debriefing with Chief Brooks and Officer Foster was the hardest part. I met them back in that same narrow corridor on Deck C, under the same buzzing fluorescent light. The space felt different now, consecrated by what we had found there. I looked both men in the eye, one a seasoned veteran who had seen it all, the other a young officer at the start of his career, and I repeated the official story, word for word. I told them that for the good of the ship, for the good of their careers, they would forget everything else. They would forget the Soviet naval uniform, the Cyrillic script on the charts, the cold weight of that sonar beacon. They would forget the look of dawning horror on the federal agent's face. Brooks, ever the loyal soldier, just gave me a single, slow nod. His jaw was set like stone. He understood how the world worked. But Foster, I saw the questions burning behind his eyes, the same questions that were screaming in my own mind. He was young enough to still believe that truth was something you sought, not something you were ordered to bury. I saw him nod, but I knew he wouldn't forget. None of us would. We had locked the secret back in the ship's belly, but now it was inside us too. The Glacier Empress continued its journey. We left Juneau under a sky the color of slate and headed north for Skagway. The passengers lined the decks, their expensive cameras clicking away at eagles and waterfalls, completely oblivious to the fact that our ship had just become a footnote in a secret history they would never read. For them, the Alaskan Inside Passage was a postcard, a beautiful, frozen moment in time. For me, it had become a labyrinth of lies. The calm, dark water I once saw as a symbol of order and predictability now looked like a shroud, hiding something monstrous beneath its surface. Every sonar ping on the bridge, every depth reading on the chart plotter, felt like a potential clue, or a potential threat. I started spending my off-duty hours in the ship's small library, not reading novels, but poring over old maritime histories of the region, searching online archives for anything: a lost fishing vessel from the 80s, an unexplained seismic event, a strange magnetic anomaly reported by an old survey ship that was dismissed as an equipment malfunction. I was chasing a ghost with a 40-year head start. The ship itself felt different. When I walked the lower decks, I could almost feel the phantom weight of that suitcase, A secret lodged in the ship's steel skeleton like a piece of shrapnel from a war that never officially happened here. We sail this route every 10 days. Seattle to Juneau, Juneau to Skagway, and back again. The faces of the passengers change, but the mountains and the sea remain. Every time we pass the Mendenhall Glacier, I go out on the wing of the bridge with my binoculars. The tourists gasp at its majestic blue crevassed face, a magnificent river of ancient ice flowing down from the mountains. But I don't see beauty anymore. I see a curtain. I see a landmark for a secret highway, a back door into a continent, designed by an enemy we thought we had defeated. I think about that Soviet officer in the photograph. What was his name? Did he have a family? Was he the one who placed the case there? A welder in a German shipyard, living a double life for years, his only companion a secret he could never share? Or was he the one it was meant for? A submarine captain who never got the call to make that impossible journey through the dark? These questions circle in my mind during the long, quiet nights at sea. The federal agents took the evidence, but they couldn't take the knowledge. They couldn't erase the image of that hand-drawn chart laid out next to the modern digital map, a perfect, impossible match. They can classify the truth. They can bury it under a mountain of paperwork and ridiculous cover stories, but they can't make it go away. It's still down there, in the cold, crushing dark beneath the ice, a silent testament to a war fought in shadows. And that leads me to the one question that keeps me awake, the one that I see in the deep black water every time I look over the rail. If the passage is real and the charts are accurate, is it still in use? What do you think was really behind that discovery? A forgotten relic of a bygone era? Or a sleeping threat, waiting for a new signal in a new war? Let me know your theories in the comments. And if you want to follow where this investigation leads me next, make sure you subscribe. I'm always interested to know what part of the world you're watching from, and if there are secrets hiding in your waters too.